The better a player gets, the less it looks like they're doing. Not because they stopped playing, not because they became passive, but because they stopped wasting actions. Most players think skill looks aggressive. Constant movement, pressure, and action. But when you watch genuinely good players, something strange happens. They often look calmer, cleaner, almost boring. They take perfect routes. They set up positions before the fight even starts. They predict where enemies will move next. And somehow they seem to arrive at the right place at the exact right time. And from the outside, that honestly doesn't look impressive. In fact, you probably have thought to yourself, I can do that too. And then you tried and got destroyed. Why? Because players confuse activity with skill. But high-level players understand something completely different. Games are not won by doing more. They're won by doing the right thing at the right time. And the better a player gets, the fewer actions they waste. Which makes it harder for beginners to actually understand what they're doing right. When people watch good players, they're often thinking they're watching normal gameplay. He's running across the map, he's entering compounds. Occasionally he opens the map and he listens for enemy teams. And then 30 seconds later, everyone is dead except him. And nothing about that sounds special at first. The problem is that most of the important decisions do not look important. They're too small, too fast, too invisible. What looks like a simple reposition might actually be the result of 5 pieces of information being combined together. What looks like patience might actually be risk management. What looks like luck might actually be a prediction. The higher the skill level becomes, the more hidden decisions are actually being implemented. And that's exactly where most people misunderstand what they're seeing.
Right, so thinking is a skill now? Incredible. The next video will be how to breathe properly.
No, the skill isn't doing nothing. The skill is actually knowing which actions are worth taking. Anybody can sprint, anybody can peek, and anybody can push. The difference is actually understanding if these actions are improving your situation right now. Because most mistakes don't happen when players do too little. They happen when players do something that never needed to happen in the first place. The difference between good and bad players aren't mechanics, it's efficiency. Bad players are constantly spending actions, whereas good players spend them very carefully. And Hunt Showdown makes this incredibly obvious. Imagine you're fighting in a compound. You tank somebody, you heal the retreat, and now you have a choice. A newer player might start moving immediately. Not because they know where they're going, but because standing still right now feels wrong. A good player, however, might also reposition, but usually because of a very specific reason. Maybe they're cutting off an escape route. Maybe they're creating a new angle. Maybe they're moving to a position the enemy is not expecting. The movement, however, serves a purpose. And that sounds simple, but it changes everything. Because movement isn't free. Every sprint creates sound. Every peek reveals information. Every reposition changes your exposure. Or to say it simply, every action carries risk. And good players understand this, which means they stop moving simply to feel productive. Most players move because it gives them a feeling of being in control. High-level players, however, move when control actually changes. And here's the important part. This does not mean that good players are slow. That's another misunderstanding. Sometimes the correct play is actually the total opposite. Sometimes you need to sprint. Sometimes you need to dodge. Sometimes you need to cross open terrain as fast as possible. And sometimes you need chaos. If you get shot in an open field, this is not the situation for elegant movements. You gotta survive, man. And good players can look incredibly aggressive when the situation demands it. The difference is understanding that even chaos has its purpose. The movement, however, still isn't random. It's solving a problem. And that is true even for patience. Because patience is probably one of the most misunderstood concepts in gaming. People think patience just means waiting. It doesn't, however. Anyone can wait. A beginner and a pro player both can sit in a bush for 10 minutes. That isn't skill. Real patience means understanding when movement becomes a dangerous option. Imagine you're trapped between 2 teams. And you know movement will reveal your position now. And you know making noise gets you killed faster. So you wait. Not because you're hiding, but because movement would be a mistake now. You're still actively listening. You're still processing information. And that's the difference. You're still making an active decision. Not just waiting in a bush somewhere. You're simply choosing to not create a problem right now. A beginner, as example, waits for something to happen. A veteran, however, waits because he knows what will happen if he moves now. And that difference is enormous. Because once every action has a purpose, something interesting happens. The actual skill gets incredibly hard to see. And this is where things become dangerous. Because the most important skills in gaming don't look like skill at all. Take a player like Rachtas. You watch him in a fight where he stands in one position. He gets a kill, moves somewhere else, and gets another kill. And the entire engagement looks incredibly simple. Almost too simple, to be honest. And now you stepped into the trap. Because the visible part isn't where the skill happened. The skill actually happened before the enemy appeared.
They are here.
He heard footsteps, he heard a vault, he understood exactly what route the enemy will be taking, and he knew where the cover would disappear. The spectator, however, only sees he moved there and got a kill, while the good player thought, I knew the enemy's position would become vulnerable in 30 seconds. And that's a completely different experience. The better the player becomes, the earlier decisions happen. And early decisions are almost invisible. Pressing the trigger isn't impressive. Everybody can do that. Even Ludwig can do that.
Hey!
The difficult part is predicting the fight before it happens. And that's why high-level gameplay often looks deceptively simple. The thinking happened before the viewer even thought about thinking about something, which creates another interesting problem. Because once skill becomes invisible, spectators start judging the wrong things.
So basically, good players are boring.
Not exactly. They're efficient, and efficiency always looks boring. Airplanes are boring, elevators are boring, even bridges are boring. However, you only notice them once something goes wrong. And good players are very similar. You don't notice the decision that prevented disaster, which means most players think that skill means winning difficult fights. However, good players often try to avoid those situations, because strong players don't trust fair fights. They only trust in advantages. Where a newer player might ask, can I win this fight? A good player asks himself, why am I even taking this fight in the first place? And that's a completely different mindset. Good players don't want 50-50 situations. They don't want coin flips or random outcomes. They want favorable situations. That's why they avoid blind pushes. That's why they avoid ego peaks. And that's why they avoid unnecessary risks. Not because they're scared, but because randomness is a terrible strategy. And this applies to almost every competitive game. League players manipulate waves before objectives. Fighting game players fish for punishing opportunities. And racing sim players take longer routes because it knows it reduces the risk. Strongest players don't always prove that they can survive difficult situations. They are constantly trying to create favorable situations for them. And from the outside, this often looks passive, but it isn't. It's just controlling the situation. And that's where many spectators get confused, because spectators naturally focus on visible moments. That one headshot, the clutch, the crazy comeback, or the aggressive push that won them the fight. But they don't see the 1,000 decisions that led to that moment. They don't see the angle that was never exposed. They don't see the rotation that removed an entire threat, which means you don't see the risk that disappeared before it became dangerous. Best decisions don't leave evidence behind. Nothing explodes. Nobody dies. Nothing dramatic happens. The problem simply never appears. And because of that, good decisions often look boring. And this creates one final problem. Beginners often confuse action with impact. They think moving more means more. They think aggression means confidence. And they think constant activity means skill. You've probably heard about the term APM. And sometimes that works. At lower skill levels, chaos alone can create opportunities. But eventually, players will hit a wall. Because experienced players understand something, beginners don't. Every action has a cost. Every movement creates risk. Every peak gives information. And every fight creates uncertainty. The goal, however, isn't to avoid action. The goal is to stop wasting opportunities. And that's why good players often look like they're doing less. Not because they're passive. Not because they're scared, and not because they're camping, but because every unnecessary action has been removed. What remains are only actions that matter. And once you start seeing games that way, you would stop asking yourself, why is he doing nothing? And instead ask yourself, why is he doing that? And by the way, if you enjoy short, high-density analysis like this one, focus on what players misunderstand skill and where competitive decision-making quietly breaks. That's exactly what this channel does. Subscribing makes sense. If there's one thing to take away from all this, it's simple. Turn actions into decisions. Before moving, ask yourself the question, what information do I gain from this? What advantage does this movement create? What happens if I wait now? Am I moving because it helps me? Or because I'm uncomfortable because of silence? Am I taking this fight because it's in my favor? Or because I'm bored? Because most gameplay mistakes aren't mechanical. They're unnecessary decisions. And the better a player gets, the better they become at removing them.